Imagine a weapon that could strike London from Germany without a pilot. Imagine a jet aircraft so fast that the best Allied fighters couldn't catch it. Imagine a submarine that could stay underwater for weeks, silent and invisible, hunting convoys across the Atlantic without ever needing to surface. Imagine a rocket that could reach the edge of space. Now stop imagining, because every single one of those weapons existed. Every one of them was built, tested, and deployed by Nazi Germany before the Second World War ended, and for a period of time that historians still find deeply uncomfortable to examine too closely. Several of them came within a margin of changing the outcome of the war entirely. This is not a story about what might have been. This is a story about what almost was. About the engineers, the scientists, the SS officers and the slave laborers and the visionaries and the fanatics who built weapons that the rest of the world would spend the next 50 years trying to understand, copy, and surpass. About the moments when those weapons came closest to tipping the balance. And about the reasons, some strategic, some accidental, some simply the result of one man's ego and another man's incompetence, why they ultimately failed to do what they were designed to do. The story begins not in 1939, not even in 1933 when Hitler came to power, but in the wreckage of the First World War. Germany in 1919 was a nation in profound shock. The Kaiser was gone. The empire was gone. The army that had held the Western Front for 4 years had been demobilized and humiliated by the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. The treaty did something that its architects believed would prevent Germany from ever starting another war. It stripped the country of its military capacity. No more air force. Strictly limited army. No more heavy artillery above certain calibers. No more submarines above certain tonnages. No more tanks. No more poison gas. The list of prohibitions was exhaustive. It was designed to leave Germany defenseless. What the treaty's architects did not anticipate was that a nation of engineers, stripped of its conventional military, would redirect that engineering genius toward something else entirely, toward the future, toward weapons that the treaty writers hadn't thought to prohibit, because those weapons didn't yet exist. Through the 1920s, quietly and often in secret, German engineers and military thinkers began exploring the edges of what was possible. Rocket societies emerged, groups of enthusiasts and theorists who were fascinated by the idea of using controlled explosions to propel objects through the air without propellers. Aviation designers began sketching engines that used turbines rather than pistons. Submarine designers worked on hull forms and the propulsion systems that could make underwater vessels faster and harder to detect. None of this was explicitly illegal. Most of it was happening in the open, in universities, in private companies, in gentlemen's clubs devoted to scientific curiosity. But underneath it all was a kind of purpose. Germany was rebuilding. And it was rebuilding in a direction that the victors of 1918 had not thought to prevent. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he found a military-industrial apparatus that was already pointed in remarkable directions. What he provided was funding, resources, state direction, and above all urgency. The weapons programs that had been theoretical or embryonic in the 1920s became crash development projects in the 1930s. The pace was extraordinary, and the ambition was without limit. To understand what Nazi Germany was attempting to build, you have to understand the German military doctrine of the period. The concept of blitzkrieg, lightning war, is well known. The idea of using speed and shock to paralyze an enemy before they could react, to strike faster than the opponent could sink, to make the decision cycle itself a weapon. But what is less often understood is that this doctrine extended beyond tanks and aircraft. It extended into the realm of what the Germans called Wunderwaffen, wonder weapons, the idea that a sufficiently advanced technology could substitute for numbers, could bypass the grinding attritional warfare that had destroyed Germany in the First World War, could win decisively, suddenly, and completely. This belief, this faith in the decisive technological weapon, drove some of the most extraordinary engineering projects in the history of warfare. Some of them were mature and practical, some were half-baked fantasies, and some occupied a terrifying middle ground, visionary enough to be genuinely dangerous, flawed enough to be ultimately fatal, but close enough to success that the margin between victory and failure was, in several cases, terrifyingly thin. Let us begin with the weapon that came closest to changing the outcome of the Battle of the Atlantic. Because the Battle of the Atlantic was, as Churchill famously acknowledged, the campaign that frightened him most throughout the entire war. If Britain lost control of the Atlantic, the island would starve. If the convoys from America stopped arriving, the fuel, the food, the weapons, the men, everything that sustained Britain's ability to fight, would cease to flow. Germany knew this, and Germany had a weapon designed specifically to exploit it. The standard German Type K7 U-boat is well known. It was the workhorse of the submarine fleet, the vessel that sank millions of tons of Allied shipping during the early years of the war, particularly during what U-boat crews called the happy time, when the Allies had neither the technology nor the tactics to effectively counter the Wolfpack. But by 1943, the balance had shifted. Allied anti-submarine technology, longer-range patrol aircraft, improved sonar and radar, the cracking of the Enigma codes, all of it conspired to turn the hunter into the hunted. In May of 1943 alone, Germany lost 41 U-boats. The campaign that had nearly strangled Britain was suddenly costing Germany more than it could afford. What most people don't know is that Germany was simultaneously developing a submarine that would have rendered most of those Allied countermeasures obsolete. The Type 21 U-boat was not an incremental improvement on existing designs. It was a revolution. Its hull was designed specifically for underwater speed and the endurance in a way that previous submarines simply were not. Earlier U-boats were, in reality, surface vessels that could temporarily submerge. They were most effective when operating on the surface, using their diesel engines. And they could only maintain high speed underwater for short bursts using their electric motors before their batteries were exhausted. This meant they had to surface regularly to recharge, and it was on the surface that they were most vulnerable to Allied aircraft and the destroyers. The Type 21 was designed to change this entirely. It had 3 times the battery capacity of the Type 7. Its streamlined hull could sustain underwater speeds of around 17 knots, faster than manned convoy escort vessels could manage on the surface. It was equipped with a Schnorchel, a breathing tube that allowed it to run its diesel engines while submerged to periscope depth, recharging its batteries without ever fully surfacing. And it carried an advanced sonar system that allowed it to attack from depth without ever needing to raise a periscope. It could detect a convoy, plot firing solutions, and launch its torpedoes, an initial salvo of up to 18 torpedoes in 20 minutes, without the crew ever seeing the target with their own eyes. The Allied sonar and radar technology that had turned the tide in 1943 would have been far less effective against a vessel that never needed the surface. The long-range patrol aircraft that had done so much damage to the existing U-boat fleet would have had almost nothing to attack. The Type 21 would have been, in the words of one Allied naval analyst who examined them after the war, the submarine that Allied anti-submarine warfare had no more good answer to. The Germans ordered over 130 Type 21 boats. They built a new form of rapid prefabricated construction, assembling the vessels from pre-built sections in inland factories and transporting them to the coast for final assembly. It was innovative manufacturing under wartime conditions. They completed many of them, but the production timeline was plagued by light bombing raids, by sabotage at the factories, by the disorganization that was increasingly endemic to German war industry in the final years, and most fatally, by the simple fact that they started too late. Only two Type 21 boats conducted operational patrols before Germany surrendered. Neither sank an Allied vessel. The weapon that could have prolonged and perhaps changed the Battle of the Atlantic never got the chance to prove itself in combat. But the navies of the world took very careful notice. The Type 21 was not buried with the Third Reich. It became the template for every major Navy submarine development for the next 2 decades. The Soviet Navy, the United States Navy, the Royal Navy. All of them studied the captured examples and built the Cold War submarine fleets on principles that German engineers had worked out in the desperate final years of the Second World War. Now turn your eyes from the sea to the sky. Because what Germany was doing in aviation during this period was nothing less than a transformation of what warfare from the air could mean. The story of the jet engine is not exclusively German. Frank Whittle in Britain had been developing his own jet engine concept since the early 1930s, but Germany industrialized the concept first. And the aircraft they produced around it was, in terms of pure performance, in a category entirely its own. The Messerschmitt Me 262 was the world's first operational jet-powered combat aircraft. It entered service with the Luftwaffe in 1944, and from the first day it flew in combat, it demonstrated a performance advantage over anything the Allies could put in the air that was so pronounced it was almost incomprehensible. It had a top speed of over 540 miles per hour. The fastest Allied piston engine fighters of the period were doing around 400. That gap was not the kind of gap you closed with tactics or with courage. It was the kind of gap that Allied pilots could not catch the Me 262 at El Chase no matter what they did. It could make a single pace at a bomber formation, fire its 430mm cannons, and be gone before the escort fighters could react. It could, when flown by an experienced pilot, dictate every aspect of an engagement. The Me 262 was also equipped with a weapon that compounded its lethality against bomber formations. The R4M rocket was an unweighted air-to-air rocket that could be fired in salvos from underwing launchers. A single pass through a B-17 formation, firing 24 R4M rockets, could destroy multiple aircraft in seconds. The defensive firepower of the bomber formations, the interlocking fire from hundreds of heavy machine guns that had made high-altitude bombing raids so costly for German piston engine interceptors, was far less effective against an aircraft moving at over 500 miles per hour. Had the Me 262 been deployed in its designed role as a pure interceptor, in the numbers and at the time that its designers and its frontline commanders wanted, the air war over Germany in 1944 and 1945 might have looked very different indeed. The strategic bombing campaign that was destroying German industry and killing German civilians and, critically, wearing down German oil production to the point of catastrophic fuel shortage, might have been made prohibitively costly. The ability of the Allied air forces to operate over Germany in daylight, which was fundamental to their entire campaign, might have been seriously challenged. But the Me 262 was not deployed as a pure interceptor. And the reason why is one of the most consequential decisions, or rather, one of the most consequential interventions of the entire war. Hitler wanted the Me 262 to be a bomber, not primarily an interceptor. A fast bomber that could strike Allied beachheads and the troop concentrations with a speed that defending fighters could not intercept. The idea was not entirely without strategic logic. A bomber that enemy fighters literally could not catch would be a revolutionary weapon, but it was not what the aircraft was best suited for. Bombing with the Mi-262 required modifications to the airframe to carry bomb loads. Those modifications affected its flight characteristics, and it required pilots to fly a complex, fast, and demanding aircraft while also managing a bomb release against a ground target, which was a very different skill set from air-to-air interception. The delays caused by this redesign and the retraining cost months. By the time the Mi-262 was finally cleared to operate primarily as an interceptor, it was late ke 1944. German fuel was critically short. Training had been cut. The pilots who had the experience to fly the aircraft at its best were a dwindling pool. And perhaps most ironically, the very bases from which the aircraft operated were being attacked by Allied fighters waiting for the Mi-262 Stilen. Because at low speeds during approach and landing, the jet aircraft lost its decisive speed advantage and became vulnerable to conventional propeller fighters. Allied P-51 Mustangs developed the tactic of orbiting Mi-262 bases and catching the jets in their most vulnerable moments. It was unglamorous, it was methodical, and it worked. The Mi-262 still achieved a kill ratio that was remarkable by any measure. German aces flying the aircraft, men like Adolf Galland, who led a special unit of the best remaining Luftwaffe pilots specifically to demonstrate the aircraft's potential, achieved extraordinary results against the light bomber formations. But the numbers were never sure. Production was disrupted, fuel was rationed, the war was already lost in the ways that ultimately mattered, and the number amount of technological advantage at the margins couldn't do that. After the war, the Allies scrambled to capture everything they could. American and the British teams raced into Germany ahead of the advancing Soviets, specifically the secure jet aircraft, jet engines, and the engineers who had built them. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey specifically identified German jet engine technology as among the most significant technical achievements of the war. The swap-wing designs that German aeronautical engineers had been developing, which gave aircraft far better high-speed characteristics than the straight-wing designs of early jets, directly influenced American jet fighter development throughout the late 1940s and the 1950s. The F-86 Sabre that fought in Korea Ora directed the German wartime research, so did virtually every subsequent generation of combat aircraft. But there was another weapon in the German arsenal that was, if anything, even more significant in terms of its long-term impact on history. And it didn't fly under a pilot's control. It didn't need one. The V-2 ballistic missile was something that had never existed before in the history of warfare. It was not a refinement of previous technology. It was a leap into a world that no one had yet imagined fighting in. It was a rocket that could carry a warhead almost 300 miles, rising to an altitude of over 50 miles. At the edge of space, reaching speeds of over 3,500 miles per hour on the way down. It arrived without warning. It arrived faster than the speed of sound, so you never heard it coming. There was no more radar defense against it. There was no more fighter aircraft fast enough to intercept it. There was, in 1944, no more answer to it at all. The V-2 was the creation of a team of engineers led by a man named Wernher von Braun, working at a facility on the Baltic coast of Germany called Peenemünde. Von Braun was, in many ways, one of the most complex and troubling figures of the entire 20th century. He was a genuine visionary. He had dreamed of space travel since childhood. He had joined the Nazi Party and the SS not. He always insisted afterward, out of ideological conviction, but because party membership was necessary to access the funding and the facilities we needed to pursue his rocket research. Whether that explanation is accepted or not, and it remains deeply contested. The rockets he built were designed and manufactured using slave labor from the concentration camps, and thousands of people died building them. The moral weight of that fact does not diminish with distance. The facility at Pinem Ende was a remarkable place by any measure. Hundreds of engineers, scientists, and technicians, some of the best technical minds in Germany, worked around problems that had never been solved before. How do you stabilize a rocket in flight? How do you guide it to a target hundreds of miles away using gyroscopes and the primitive electronic systems? How do you build an engine that burns liquid oxygen and the ethanol and produces 25 tons of thrust without destroying itself in the process? These were not incremental engineering challenges. These were fundamental problems at the frontier of human knowledge, and the team at Pinem Ende solved them, one by one, over the course of almost a decade. The British discovered Pinem Ende in 1943, partly through intelligence work and partly through the analysis of a remarkable piece of luck. A crashed V2 test vehicle that was recovered in Sweden and allowed British analysts to understand what they were dealing with. The RAF mounted a massive raid on Pinem Ende in August of 1943. It was a precise and carefully planned attack, one of the first precision bombing raids of the war, aimed specifically at the scientists and the engineers rather than the production facilities. The raid killed several hundred people, including some key technical personnel. But it did not stop the program. It delayed it. The Germans dispersed the operation, moved production underground, and continued. The V2 began striking London and Antwerp in September tahun 1944. Over the following months, over 3,000 were launched against Allied targets. They killed around 9,000 civilians, wounded men more, and caused enormous damage to infrastructure and to civilian morale. But they did not change the course of the war. And the reason why tells you something important about the nature of technological weapons and the relationship to strategic reality. The V2 was extraordinarily expensive to produce. Each missile cost more than a contemporary fighter aircraft. The resources consumed by the program, the steel, the aluminum, the fuel, the engineering talent, the labor, were resources that could have been used elsewhere in the German war economy. And each V2, despite its revolutionary technology, carried only about a ton of conventional explosive. A single 4-engine B-17 bomber carried roughly the same bomb load, and it could be reused. To deliver the same destructive effect as a sustained bombing raid, Germany would have needed to fire hundreds of V2s. The missiles were tactically impressive and strategically inefficient. Furthermore, the V2's guidance system was not precise enough for it to be used effectively against specific military targets. It could be aimed at a city. It could not be aimed at a particular railway junction or oil refinery or supply depot. It was, fundamentally, a terror weapon. And the terror alone, as Britain had already demonstrated during the Blitz, was not enough to break a nation's will to fight. But here is the thing. Had the V2 existed in 1940 instead of 1944, had it been ready before the Battle of Britain, before the failure of Operation Sea Lion, before the decision to invade the Soviet Union had locked Germany into a two-front war, had it been available in quantity when German strategic advantage was still real, then the calculation changes. A weapon of that kind, targeted against British ports, against RAF airfields, against the concentration points of British military power in southern England, with no more possible interception, no more warning, no more defense, arriving without sound at over 3,000 miles per hour, might have been decisive in a way it simply could not be by 1944, when the war was already lost. In every dimension that mattered, the V2 was not the only secret weapon in this family. Its predecessor, the V1 flying bomb, was technologically simpler but operationally significant in different ways. The V1 was a pulse jet-powered cruise missile, a precursor of the precision-guided weapons that would transform warfare half a century later. It flew at altitudes and the speeds that made it vulnerable to interception by fast fighter aircraft and the anti-aircraft guns, and the Allies developed effective countermeasures over time. But during the weeks immediately after the D-Day landings in June 1944, when nearly 2,000 V1s were being launched against Britain every month, the campaign placed an enormous strain on British air defenses and diverted resources from other priorities at a critical moment. And the Dancer was the third member of this family of weapons, one that is far less widely known but potentially the most frightening of all. The V3 was a supergun, not a conventional artillery piece, but a system of interconnected chambers built directly into the hillside at a site in the Pas de Calais in northern France called Mimoyes. The concept was to use a series of sequentially ignited propellant charges along a barrel over 100 meters long to achieve muzzle velocities that would allow shells to be fired directly at London, over 100 miles away, at a rate of several hundred rounds per hour. Not one shell, not 10. Hundreds per hour, continuously, without aircraft, without pilots, without warning. A rain of high explosive falling on the British capital at a rate that would have made the V1 and the V2 campaigns look restrained. The site was discovered and subjected to sustained attack by the RAF and the USAF, using newly developed deep penetration bombs specifically designed to destroy hardened underground structures. The damage was severe enough that Germany ultimately abandoned the project. Only a test installation was ever completed, and it achieved only a fraction of the intended range. The V3 never fired a shot at London, but the concept itself, the idea of a fixed supergun installation delivering continuous bombardment against a distant target, was something that military planners took extremely seriously for decades afterward. Let US turn to the land war, because the technological revolution that Germany was undertaking was not limited to the sea and the sky. On the ground, German engineers were pushing the boundaries of armored warfare in ways that would echo through military history for generations. The Tiger tank is one of the most iconic weapon systems of the Second World War. Its reputation, earned in combat from North Africa to the Eastern Front to Normandy, was extraordinary. Its frontal armor was effectively immune to most Allied anti-tank weapons at standard engagement ranges. Its 8.8 cm gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges that exceeded the effective range of Allied weapons against the Tiger. Small numbers of Tigers could indeed get hold of vastly larger Allied armored forces. The kill ratio achieved by Tiger-equipped units was, in purely tactical terms, remarkable. But the Tiger was also heavy, expensive, mechanically complex, and difficult to transport and maintain. Germany produced just under 1,400 of them. The Soviet Union produced nearly 60,000 T-34s. The United States produced 50,000 Shermans. Numbers, ultimately, have a quality all their own. The Tiger II, the Royal Tiger, took the concept even further. It was the heaviest operational tank deployed by any nation during the Second World War. Its frontal armor was virtually impenetrable by any Allied weapon in service. But it was so heavy that it frequently broke bridges, was extremely difficult to recover when it broke down, and consumed fuel at a rate that the chronically fuel-short German Army of 1944 and 1945 struggled to sustain. It was a technological marvel that the logistical and the industrial reality of a losing war prevented from being a war-winning weapon. More significant in terms of long-term influence was the Sturmgewehr ke-44, the STG ke-44. This was the world's first mass-produced assault rifle. Before the STG-44, infantry combat was defined by the choice between the bolt-action rifle, accurate and powerful at long range but slow to fire, and the submachine gun, fast-firing but limited to short range. The STG-44 combined both concepts into a single weapon. It fired an intermediate cartridge that was less powerful than a full rifle round but far more controllable in automatic fire, at ranges that covered the majority of actual infantry engagements. It gave a single soldier the firepower that previously required a crew-served weapon or several men. Hitler famously dismissed the concept when it was first presented to him. When frontline reports began coming in from the Eastern Front describing its effectiveness, production was accelerated. But by then, Germany had neither the time nor the industrial capacity to equip its entire infantry with the new weapon. The AK-47, perhaps the most ubiquitous and the influential infantry weapon in the history of modern warfare, was developed by Mikhail Kalashnikov after the Second World War. Kalashnikov himself acknowledged familiarity with the STG-44, the design principles, the intermediate cartridge, the selective fire capability, the gas-operated mechanism. The assault rifle concept itself flowed directly from German wartime development into the weapons that armed armies across the world throughout the Cold War and beyond. When you look at the conflicts of the 20th and the 21st centuries, from Vietnam to Afghanistan to every insurgency and the civil war in between, you are looking at a world shaped in part by a weapon concept that German engineers developed in desperation during the final years of the Second World War. There are weapons that deserve mention which never made it out of the development or prototype phase, but which tell you something about the extremity of German military ambition. The Horten Ho-229 was a flying wingjet aircraft, a design that reduced radar cross-section decades before stealth technology became a formal military concept. It was tested in 1944 and demonstrated flight characteristics that impressed everyone who flew it. Full production never began. A surviving prototype was captured by American forces in 1945 and studied extensively. When American engineers at Northrop Grumman examined it decades later as part of research into stealth technology, they concluded that, had it been produced in quantity, the Ho-229's radar cross-section would have been significantly lower than conventional aircraft of the period. It was not a true stealth aircraft in the modern sense, but it was a hint of the principle, conceived and built in a desperate wartime program by two brothers, Reimar and Walter Horten, who were more interested in the aerodynamic elegance of the flying wing than in its military applications. The Bachemba 349 Nada was a vertically launched rocket-powered interceptor designed to be operated by minimally trained pilots, essentially a man-surface-to-air missile. It was a concept born of desperation, an attempt to find some answer to Allied bombing at a time when trained pilots and the aviation fuel were both critically short. The pilot would be launched vertically, intercept a bomber formation using a battery of unguided rockets, then eject in the descent by parachute while the aircraft itself returned to Earth on a separate parachute for reuse. It was tested. The first manned vertical launch, in February 1945, killed the test pilot. The program continued anyway, because Germany by that point had very little to lose by continuing it. Several were readied for operational use, but the war ended before they flew in combat. The Enzian was an early surface-to-air guided missile. The Heintochter was another. The X-4 was our guided air-to-air missile. The HS-293 was a glide bomb with radio guidance that was used operationally against Allied shipping and achieved notable successes before countermeasures were developed. All of these weapons represented early explorations of principles: the guided missile, the precision munition, the surface-to-air defense system that would define post-war military technology. None of them was mature enough, none was produced in sufficient quantities, none was reliable enough to change the war. But every one of them pointed in a direction. And the answer is the darkest chapter. The weapons program that Germany pursued not in factories or wind tunnels or on test ranges, but in the minds of physicists who understood what the atom could do. Germany had the scientific talent. Otto Hahn had discovered nuclear fission in Berlin in ke-1938. Werner Heisenberg, one of the founding figures of quantum mechanics and arguably the greatest theoretical physicist in Germany, led the German nuclear weapons program. The fundamental science was understood. The basic physics of what a nuclear weapon would require was grasped, at least in outline. Why Germany failed to build an atomic bomb is a question that has generated more historical debate than almost any other single topic from the Second World War. The explanations are multiple and contested. Heisenberg may have made fundamental calculation errors about the critical mass of fissile material required. The program may have been deliberately underfunded because it was judged to require resources that couldn't be spared. The heavy water production facilities in Norway were sabotaged by Allied special forces and then bombed. A series of operations that directly set back the program's timeline. Jewish physicists who might have been crucial contributors had been driven out of Germany by Nazi racial policy, and none of them ended up working for the Manhattan Project. The management of the German nuclear program was fragmented, lacking the single-minded organizational focus that the Manhattan Project under General Leslie Groves brought to the American effort. Perhaps most significantly, Germany's nuclear program suffered from the same fundamental flaw that afflicted so many of its secret weapons projects. It was started too late. It was given insufficient resources, and yet was pursuing multiple competing approaches simultaneously without the organizational structure to choose between them and concentrate effort. The Manhattan Project succeeded partly because it was given essentially unlimited resources and a single clear directive. Germany's equivalent effort was never given either. The question of what would have happened had Germany succeeded even partially in nuclear weapons development is one that historians approach with extreme caution, because it takes you into territory where the word catastrophic becomes entirely inadequate. After the war ended, what followed was a scramble that revealed, more clearly than any wartime intelligence assessment could have, just how seriously the Allied powers took German technological achievement. Operation Paperclip, the American program to recruit and relocate German scientists and engineers to the United States, was not a small or incidental program. It was a systematic, government-directed effort that ultimately brought over 1,600 German scientists, engineers, and technicians to America, along with enormous quantities of technical documentation and hardware. It operated in parallel with similar British and French efforts. And the Soviets, characteristically, simply took what they wanted from the eastern portion of Germany, including entire factories, laboratories, and the populations of technical workers. Wernher von Braun and most of the Pinem and Rakit team surrendered to American forces, carefully and deliberately, because they had decided that America was where they wanted the work to continue. Von Braun spent the following decades at the center of the American space program. It was his team, using a direct development path from the V2, that built the Saturn V rocket that carried American astronauts to the moon in ke-1969. The fact that the first humans to walk on the moon were delivered by technology that began in a Nazi weapons program, built by slave laborers who died in their thousands underground, is one of those historical ironies so extreme that it strains the capacity for ordinary moral language. The jet engine technology captured at the wars and shaped American and the Soviet aviation for decades. The aerodynamic research from German wind tunnels fed directly into the design of early American supersonic aircraft. The submarine technology of the Type 21 influenced every major naval power's underwater warfare doctrine through the Cold War. The assault rifle concept of the S-344 armed the world's armies and the insurgencies for the remainder of the century. The guided missile technology of the HS-293 and the Enzian and the X-4 became the precision weapons revolution that transformed warfare from the Gulf War onward. Germany lost the Second World War. That is not in question. It was defeated comprehensively, its cities reduced to rubble, its armies destroyed, its regime dismantled, its leaders killed or imprisoned or hanged. The combination of forces arrayed against it, the industrial power of the United States, the manpower of the Soviet Union, the tenacity of Britain, the resistance movements of occupied Europe, was simply too great to overcome regardless of what weapons Germany could field. But the question that haunts this story is not whether Germany won. It is how close some of these weapons came to changing specific, critical moments in the war. If the Type 21 had been ready by 1942 instead of 1945, what would have happened to the Atlantic convoys? If Hitler had not insisted on converting the Mi-262 to a bomber role? If the jet interceptor had been deployed in strength during the critical summer of 1944 when the Allied strategic bombing campaign was at its height, could the oil shortage that was strangling German military operations have been delayed long enough to matter? If the V2 had existed in 1940, before the critical window of Allied resurgence closed, what would have happened to Britain's ability to remain in the war? No one can answer those questions with certainty. History doesn't offer rehearsals, but the margins were smaller than is comfortable. And the lesson of those small margins is not a comfortable one. Technology does not win wars by itself. The German experience demonstrates this with terrible clarity. A nation can possess the most sophisticated weapons in the world and still lose if the political leadership is irrational, if the strategic decisions are catastrophic, if the resources are misallocated, if the organizational structure is fragmented and dysfunctional, if the enemies arrayed against you simply have more of everything that ultimately matters. More men, more machines, more oil, more food, more time. But technology can change the cost of winning. It can change the timeline. It can change who survives and who does not survive the process of victory. And in the case of the weapons that Germany developed in the shadow laboratories and the underground factories and the test ranges of the Third Reich, the technology that emerged, captured, analyzed, copied, and improved by the victors, changed the world that came after in ways that are still being felt. The Cold War arms race was, in significant part, a race to surpass what Germany had started. The space race was a contest between two powers who had both recruited German rocket scientists and were racing to see who could push the technology furthest. The precision-guided weapons that have defined military conflicts since the 1990s are the descendants of German wartime guidance systems. The submarine doctrines of the Cold War were written in response to what the Type 21 represented. The assault rifle that arms nearly every military force on Earth today carries the genetic signature of the S-344. The men who built these weapons were not heroes. Many of them participated, directly or indirectly, in crimes of enormous magnitude. The rockets that von Braun built were built on this. The factories that produced the V1 and the Mi-262 and the Tiger tanks used forced labor drawn from the concentration camp system. The regime that funded and directed all of this research was one of the most murderous in human history. None of the technological achievement can be separated from that context, and none of it should be. But the weapons themselves went on. They outlasted the regime that created them. They passed through the hands of the victors and they became part of a world shaped profoundly by what Germany's engineers had discovered in their desperate race to find weapons that could, somehow, change an outcome that the deeper realities of the war had already determined. They almost did. Several of them came close enough to the edge of decisive that only a combination of Allied action, German organizational dysfunction, Hitler's personal interference, and the accumulated weight of strategic realities was enough to ensure they fell short. That is the haunting thought they carry away from the story. Not that the weapons failed, but how close they came to not failing. And what that tells us about the relationship between technological genius, political madness, and the terrible, fragile contingency of history. The world that exists today is not the one that would have existed if any of several moments had gone differently. Somewhere in the gap between those possible worlds and this one, the margin was terrifyingly thin, and the men who were racing to close it, brilliant, driven, morally compromised, some of them fully aware of what they were serving, some of them willfully blind to it, came closer than we have ever been entirely comfortable acknowledging. The weapons they built changed history twice. Once by nearly winning a war for a regime that the world still struggles to find adequate language to describe, and again, in the hands of the victors, by shaping the world that arose from the ruins of everything those weapons ultimately failed to save. That is the final, unresolvable truth of the secret weapons of Nazi Germany. They lost, and they won anywhere.